If you lack confidence with miniature painting, basing may seem like an extra level of difficulty you would rather not grapple with. But a good base can exponentially increase the immersion of a well-painted miniature, and even a relatively simple base effect can greatly improve your overall result. So in this video, I'm going to show you why basing is one of my favourite parts of the hobby process, and why you don't need to be afraid to give it a try. Mythic battles can be played over a variety of board styles from water to lava, so it is not possible to create a scenic base style that will perfectly fit the board in every scenario. Instead, I prefer to consider what will evoke the essence of the model I'm working on best, and treat each model as its own little vignette, rather than worrying about a cohesive scheme. The Hydra hunt scenario describes the Hydra as a swamp creature, and indeed its biology makes it look amphibious, so a swamp effect seemed the way to go. Going full bayou was definitely an option, but having grown up in the United Kingdom, words like swamp, bog and marsh mean things considerably different than to those of you across the pond. Essentially, I wanted to replicate something of the wet terrain I was familiar with, more of a waterlogged, muddy environment, perhaps close to a larger body of water with steep banks and rotting wood. Naturally, I came up with a detailed step-by-step plan before attempting such an important base. Okay, so maybe I didn't know exactly what I was going to end up with, but for me, iteration is part of the joy of basing. Worst case scenario, I knew that I'd probably be able to scrape everything off the base and start again. The idea was to be creative and see where I ended up. The way the model is placed by default doesn't leave much of a canvas to add scenic elements, so I removed the model from its base so that I could reposition it, and also aid the painting process. If you haven't seen my video covering the painting of the Hydra itself, you may wish to check it out after this video. By rotating the model slightly and moving it further towards one edge, I created space on one side for some larger scenic elements. However, I need to think about where the model is going to be on the base, otherwise the risk is I will build up details that block the Hydra's return. I'm using a Sharpie here to mark the Hydra's position. This shows me where I can build up the model without risk. If you accidentally move the model while drawing, which I did, just realign her and continue. I now know anything in this hashed area needs to be kept reasonably flat, while other areas can have objects such as rocks and logs if desirable. The eye line of the model is relatively low compared to the gods and larger monsters in the game, so I decided I wanted to add a slight muddy bank to elevate the Hydra and make her look as if she is emerging from a larger pool. I started by using the Sharpie to roughly mark where I wanted this bank to be, and then used green stuff to start to model this. For larger structures there are better ways to go, but I specifically wanted the green stuff as a means of sculpting the depression of the Hydra's feet. It is important to have wet hands throughout this process to reduce and smooth fingerprints and stop the putty sticking to your fingers. I started with a smaller piece of green stuff and added more to reduce wastage. On the side facing the interior of the base, I pressed the cylinder of green stuff onto the base and then smoothed this down to create the bank. I tried to make this relatively straight rather than matching the curve of the base, as this ensures that it looks like the Hydra is emerging from a random place on a long bank, as opposed to it looking like it is sat in a giant Hydra-sized puddle. Knowing that this side would be covered in sand or mud, I didn't worry about leaving fingerprints, but water was still important to blend the edge of the bank with the surface of the base. On the new edge of the base you have created, you will be left with an uneven surface probably covered in fingerprints as I have here. To solve this, I moistened the end of a paintbrush as well as the surface I wished to flatten, and used the edge of the base as a guide to roll over the surface so that it matched the base edge in both position and flatness. You will need some level of overhang for this to work, so you may need to push a little from the other side and repeat, as I am doing here. The main aim is to remove all the fingerprints on this side. The ridge doesn't need to be even, in fact it's better if it isn't, as it will look more natural. Here I have some resin wood pieces and tree stumps from Model Display Products, MDP, which I have already washed with soapy water to remove resin dust and mould release before use. I am testing these out to see whether any of them will fit in a pleasing way on the base without touching the checkered area. In the end I opted for 3 pieces. This stump will fit nicely beside the Hydra, perhaps a long rotting tree or something the Hydra itself has destroyed as it hurries towards its prey. This small log I want to protrude from the bank, which I can achieve while the green stuff hasn't fully cured. Lastly, I have this large log which I intend to overhang the base slightly, further breaking the circular shape of the base and creating the sense of a larger environment. I sliced off the curve of the bank at this stage for the same reason. I secured the resin pieces to the base using superglue. I prefer the gel type for this, but any superglue will work. In the case of the log protruding from the bank, I added a small amount of additional green stuff over the top of the log at the bank end to make it look like it's part of a longer piece that is either growing out of the bank or has become stuck in it. It is important that we create the handprints of the Hydra before the green stuff cures, so our next step is to place the Hydra onto the bank. This is where I made a classic Victor foobar, as I forgot to moisten the feet of the Hydra before pressing it into the bank. This resulted in the feet of the Hydra immediately sticking in place, and the force required to pull it free was sufficient to ruin the bank. I also had to spend an unhappy half an hour picking green stuff from between the Hydra's toes. This required me to remodel the bank and try again, which was possible as the green stuff has quite a long working time, but I would encourage you to learn from my stupidity wherever possible. This just goes to show that basing is a forgiving art, and it's okay to make mistakes. There is a balance with positioning the Hydra here. If you put the feet too far forward, they will destroy the bank edge to the point at which you will be unable to get a smooth finish back on the outer side. However, you do need the green stuff to be deep enough that the new peg holes are created, which will ensure the Hydra is secure when we glue her back onto the base. Wetting the Hydra's forelimbs, I made the impression and then removed almost immediately. I smoothed the indentation of the bank, though it's important that this doesn't alter the footprints themselves, or the Hydra won't fit later. I also smoothed the top of the bank, which had become a sharp point during my restoration efforts. I let the green stuff cure completely before proceeding. This next step turned out to be unnecessary, but it is included as it is noticeable in the following shots. I had thought to use a mud effect on the bank and then resort to sand at the low points when I considered slightly deeper water from the Hydra. I realised later that I wanted a consistent colour to the whole base and ended up covering this sand with a layer of mud. Again, experimentation is very much part of the process and the fun of basing for me. I then primed the model using black spray paint and then used some selective bursts of white from directly above to create a rough zenithal highlight. It is important that the wood elements are painted before the mud is added. This way the mud will overspill onto completed wood and not the other way around. Areas that would be covered with bark were painted using a combination of scale colour birch and scale colour walnut. I recommend keeping your paints reasonably thin to let the zenithal undercoat show a little bit and create some natural contrast, but other than that you can be very quick and rough with this step. I then painted internal wood areas using pure scale colour birch. Once this has had time to fully dry, you can increase the contrast by thinning some Vallejo Sapphire ink with water and adding this over the wood, being careful to avoid pooling. Now is a good moment to glue your fully painted and varnished Hydra onto the base. Although the following steps are messy, we want the Hydra integrated with mud and water. A modest amount of superglue into the footholes is sufficient. As these footprints are a snug fit, they will be more than adequate to keep the Hydra on its base, especially once we have added mud. The Hydra restored to her base and the glue having dried, it is time to add a texture paint. This is basically a mix of paint and sand that allows you to create some ground texture. It is also strong enough when dry to make small banks and depressions according to your need. This particular paint, Vallejo Thick Mud, is available in a variety of shades, this one being Russian Mud. If you wanted to base a large number of models this way, it would be worth buying this product in the larger jars that are available. I wouldn't recommend using a brush you care about for this step. You could use some other form of applicator, but I had an old brush to hand and I wanted the ability to move the mud around a bit once it was applied to the base. Take fairly large scoops of the paint and apply as required, remembering that any shapes you leave in the surface will set hard and remain there, which gives the opportunity to create small puddles and other shapes. For example, here you can see me creating another small ridge of mud next to the log, as if it has drifted onto a muddy bank of its own. As mentioned earlier, I initially intended to only put this on the bank and other select areas, but the mud was a lot darker than I'd expected, and I realised it made more sense to have consistency across the base. I therefore made sure to have at least a thin layer of the mud effect present all over the base. I also created a shallow ridge all around to contain the water effect when it was added. Not doing so would have required me to mask off the model in some other way, as the water effect will run off any flat surface. Because we only want relatively shallow pools, it is possible to add a very shallow bump of texture paint around the waterlogged area without it looking too out of place. I recommend giving the mud a couple of days to fully dry if possible, as it can really affect the following steps if you progress too soon. I felt the mud was a little monotonous, so I applied a dry brush using a lighter brown paint. To do a dry brush, apply paint to a large brush you don't care about too much. A makeup brush is particularly good for this. And wipe most of the paint into a piece of paper towel until barely any paint appears to be on the brush. Then move the brush roughly over the area you want to cover. The remaining paint on the brush will pick up the uppermost details. As the name of the technique suggests, starting with a really dry brush and using a reasonably thick paint will usually aid this technique. I want to add some ground foliage for the areas of the base that won't be underwater, and I'm using forest scatter from Baseworks to do so. There are lots of similar products on the market. I've even seen people use dry tea leaves to achieve a similar effect. In fact, judging by the smell of this forest scatter, that may well be one of the components. I'm applying relatively thin PVA glue to the areas required and then sprinkling the foliage over the top. I'll then tap off the excess. I also used some summer undergrowth from Army Painter Battlefields to create the effect of something growing on top of our rotting wood pieces. All these steps are designed to increase the colour variation on the base and make it seem like a natural habitat. Let the PVA dry thoroughly because our next step is to add the all-important water effects. If you wish, you could paint the base rim at this stage and varnish it before adding the water effects, which would save you being careful not to get matte varnish on the water effects. With hindsight, there was no reason to delay these steps. I'm going to use still water texture from Fulero for this step, a self-leveling and very runny product which can and will get everywhere if you don't take steps to control it. Having that small ridge around where I want the water is critical to ensure the product remains on the base. I'm mixing the water in a plastic cup and starting with a very modest quantity as we can always add a second layer. I decided to make the water semi-opaque and darker by adding a small quantity of Secret Weapon green-black wash. This doesn't change the end effect very much and could be skipped if desirable, but if you are going to add any colour to the water, my advice is to do so a few drops at a time. I placed the Hydra onto a piece of waste polystyrene both to allow me to move the miniature while keeping it flat and also to catch any overspill. I used the edge of an old paintbrush to run the water effect into the areas of the base we want standing water. This allows you to get underneath the Hydra if needed, but it's important not to add more liquid than your banks can contain. If you want the upper areas to still look wet, you can brush some of the excess liquid onto these areas and they will have a glossy finish that creates this effect. The water effect shrinks to some extent after it is applied and is ideally added in multiple thin layers. As you can see, our first layer was sufficient to make the ground look muddy, but didn't give me large standing pools, so after leaving the first layer for 24 hours to cure, I went in with the second layer, this time without the additional shade. At this point, I made a second foobar and accidentally let some of the water effect hit the top of one of the Hydra's heads. I quickly applied a wet paintbrush to thin the water mixture and then used a piece of paper towel to remove the liquid. Having done so, the mistake left no appreciable effect on the paint or the matte finish of the varnish on the Hydra. Once this second coat had dried, I was ready to apply some finishing touches. I applied black paint to the rim of the base, which I always feel makes the model stand out nicely on its base. Once dry, I applied a matte varnish to the areas of the base that were intended to look dry, as well as the base rim. As mentioned earlier, you could equally do this before adding the water. Lastly, I took a small amount of the water effect and used it to fix some leaves to the surface of our puddles of water, creating the effect that the leaves are floating on a deep puddle. Using the water effect for this rather than glue prevents any reaction with the rest of the water and can also create a nice impression of surface tension, helping to sell our pools as real water. And with that, our base is complete and Hydra is ready for a glorious battle. It's probably apparent that I would do some things differently next time around, but overall I was very happy with the outcome, especially when the first reaction it received was a genuine wow. And honestly, if you take nothing else from this video, it should be that you don't have to be an expert or have a perfect plan to get creative with basing for models and achieve a good result. Let us know if you try this approach yourself and what other basing tutorials you'd like to see in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. And above all, work hard, play better, and take care out there.